Right. So this is the second part of the lecture. So after in the previous videos, you have learned about the general idea of social psychology, as well as a bit of description whether social psychology is a scientific discipline or just a hunch. In this particular video, I'm going to give you some sort of short explanation about the tradition of knowledge extraction in psychology, how social psychologists formulate their theories and test their theories according to scientific logic. Yeah. So what you are seeing now on your screen is the general idea how scientific logic works. So it firstly starts with a hunch, a intuitive knowledge that comes from anecdotal observation. So in this case, you would see, you would derive the hypothesis, derive the research question, or formulate the research questions based on your previous experience or maybe your anecdotal observation. So for example, if you see a male are more aggressive, if it is compared to the woman, then you would formulate a hypothesis or a theory that gender would have, there is a relationship between gender and also aggressive tendencies. And then after you observe that male tend to be more aggressive than women, then you would formulate a theory about that. And you would propose that there's some kind of relation. Gender could explain why some people would be more aggressive than the others. And then you would, after formulating the theory, then you would propose a very specific prediction according to that theory. And you would see that, you would say that male tend to be more orally aggressive, or they swear the curse word more often than women. Yeah. So we don't use aggressive anymore, because that would be quite general, quite abstract. You need to derive a prediction that is more specific and observable and testable. And in this case, we operationalize aggression or aggressive tendencies by saying that or swearing the curse word would be an indication of aggressive behavior or oral aggressive behavior. Then you would propose a prediction that male would be more often swearing than their counterparts. And then after formulating those description or prediction, then you would conduct a empirical research in order to confirm or disconfirm the prediction. Yeah, after seeing the pattern in your data, whether the data confirm your prediction or disconfirm your prediction, when it is confirmed, when the data confirms your prediction, it means that you would be more confident in saying that I have the evidence that male are more often cursing the swearing words rather than the women. But what happened if you don't find any patterns to support your prediction? It means that you might lose your confidence in your prediction, and you can't be confident anymore in saying that the gender could be a good explanation why people swearing more often, because men and women swearing just equal. They swear. There's no differences between men and women when you try to observe how they swear, the frequency of swearing words in a day, for example. And what happens if your confidence in theory reduced? You could modify the theory and you can retest it again. You might say that, okay, gender might have not some relation. Maybe it could be mediated with, I don't know, culture, for example. Then you would modify the theory. You would say that gender might have some relationship, but between gender and also aggressive behavior, there is the third variable that explains why gender might have some relation with aggressive behavior. That is, might be some culture. In some culture, maybe, for example, in Japanese, women swearing curse word would be kind of odd and unusual, and so that culture might have some relation why the patterns or the relationship between gender and and aggressive behavior would be spurious. Then you would conduct more empirical research to confirm or disconfirm that prediction. Or whether you just completely trash out the prediction and says that there's no relationship between gender and aggressive behavior. So basically, men and women are equally aggressive towards other people. Yeah, so that's how scientific logic works. Sometimes your prediction confirmed, and some other time it is disconfirmed. So it's a normal part of the scientific logic. Even some scientists would confirm that their prediction are disconfirmed more often than confirmed by the data. Yeah, so the most important process in scientific logic is that looking at the coherence between your prediction and also the data that you are collected to confirm or disconfirm the prediction. Right, so in social psychology, there are many ways to do research. There are many ways to build theories, to test theories. But the most important contribution of social psychology that they gave to the general idea of the general development of psychology as a science is that it's experimental tradition. Yeah. So in social psychology, experimental methods has contributed more than any other research design. Yeah. So we are indebted a lot from this method, and there are a lot of core theories in social psychology that were developed using this method. So this is extremely important method to master. Yeah. But unfortunately, in our campus, there is the tradition of doing experimental methods has been quite undermined and overlooked, I would say. But even though this is extremely important in progressing our field, because when you're doing experimental methods, it means that you have more probability or more opportunity to confirm causal relationship between two phenomena, for example. But if you're doing other than experimental methods, it could barely confirm the causal relationship between several phenomena, for example. And in experimental method, there are some terminology that you need to be familiar with. And the first thing when we talk about research is that the variable. Yes, so variable under study. So when we're talking about research, we're trying to look a pattern between phenomena that is varied. Yeah, so this is why we call them variable, because it is varied. When there is no variation between variable, then it's not a variable. So we're looking at pattern from variation. Yeah, in experimental methods, we recognize there are some variables that we are interested in studying. So the first thing is the independent variable, and it concerns and some people would say this is not only independent variable, but some people would say predictor variable or factor variable. I don't know. Maybe predictor would be the best, or manipulation variable, treatment variable. So this is basically the variable that causes change to dependent variable or outcome variable. For example, if I am curious whether giving you candies would increase your test score, then giving candy would be an independent variable, because it would somehow cause change in the test score. So I would expect that if the students will be given candies before the test, they would perform better. So they would have a better or higher score in their tests. And in this case, the test score would be the dependent variable. But of course, there are the third variable that also affect the dependent variable, because maybe getting candies would not be the best explanation why your test score would be varied. Maybe previously you have learned about the materials before, so maybe your motivation to learn about the material would also explain why your test score would be varied. Or perhaps intelligence would be also a confounding variable that explains why some students perform better in the test rather than the other. So we could say that there are many other variables that influence or affect the dependent variable, but those confounding variables are not necessarily included in our study. So that's why we call it confounding variable. Any other variables that affect the dependent variables, but we are not interested in studying in. And also, in experimental research, we also recognize two types of ways of doing this experimental research. The first thing is that doing the experimental research in a laboratory setting, it means that we have a lots of control in the environment. We could standardize the environment. In that case, we could very sure that if the independent variable causes change to dependent variable, we are very confident that the independent variable that causes change, not any other variables that we could not control. So we could very confident in concluding the causal relationship between independent and also dependent variable. But we could also do a field experiment, in a more naturalistic setting, because sometimes if we want to explain our social phenomena, it is rather difficult to conclude our findings in an experiment in laboratory setting, because sometimes you could not see the pattern. You could not see or find a similar pattern in a naturalistic setting, in the real life setting. So some people would choose to use a field experiment, or maybe you would be familiar with social experiments and stuff like that. But the problem is that there are lots of things that you could not control in a more naturalistic in a naturalistic setting. So if you are doing field experiment research in one context and you try to replicate those research in another context, you would be surprised that you might not find a similar or consistent result. This is because you simply cannot control lots of variables at once when you have to do a field studies experiment. So that would be quite. There's a trade-off in that. So you need to be very careful in choosing the right design for your research. So talking about experimental research, there are two things that researchers need to consider. The first thing is external validity or mundane realism, and the other is that internal validity or experimental realism. So as a researcher, you need to be very sure that if you try to replicate your research, if you want to redo your whole research in a completely different setting, normally you would you want to have a consistent result, because if it's not consistent, then you start to question whether your first experiment gives you the realistic conclusion that closer to the truth. Then normally you would like to see another consistent result when you redo your experiment, and that concerns on the external validity, whether findings from one particular research could be replicated in another study in the different contexts. And the second important thing that you need to consider when you're doing experimental research is also internal validity. It means that you need to be very sure that if you want to look an effect of an independent variable to the change of dependent variable, you need to be very sure that if there's a change that you observe in your experiment, there is a change in dependent variable, it is solely caused by the independent variable, not by any other variables. So in that example, the candy example, so if there is any differences or there is a variation or increase in the test score, me as a researcher, I'd like to conclude, and I need to be very sure that the change is caused by the candy, not by any other variables that might influence the conclusion of the experiment. It is not caused by intelligence. It is not caused by the motivation. It is not caused by any other variables that I'm not interested in studying in. Yeah. So what I'm going to do in that experiment to make sure that I have an internal validity of my experiment is that I'm going to do two things that are essential in experimental methods. The first thing that I'm going to do is that randomization or random assignment. And the second thing is that blinding or masking. So this would concern on the last part, the last terminology that I'm going to explain to you. So what I'm going to do in my experiment is that I'm going to divide the class into two different groups. So the first groups will be given candy, and the other groups, I won't give them anything. And at the end of the experiment, I'm going to compare the test score between these two groups to see whether the groups that are given the candy would have higher test score than the groups that are not given the candy. So it's a very simple idea of doing an experiment. So I have two different groups. The groups that I give the candy would be the experimental or treatment groups, and the rest of the students who are not given the candy would be the control group. So I'm going to compare the result of their test score at the end of the experiment between the groups, the treatment groups that are given the candy, and also the control groups who are not given anything. So we expect that the treatment groups the students in the treatment groups would have higher test score than those groups than students who are not given the candies. And in this case, and to make sure that any other variables do not influence my conclusion, what I'm going to do is that to determine which students assigned to which groups, I'm going to do a randomization. So I'm going to randomly assign a number of students so that in those two groups they have homogeneous characteristics. So we could arrange before the experiment is conducted, we could make sure that those two groups, they have equal intelligence score, they have equal motivation, so that we are very sure that if there are differences between the test score, it is not caused by intelligence, it is not caused by motivation, because we are sure before the experiment is conducted, their condition is equal. The condition of between these two groups is equal. And to make sure that the condition is equal, we should do the random assignment. So we randomly assign students, which students assigned to which groups. We determine that by doing a random assignment. And also, we have problems as well with experimental effect. Sometimes the result or the conclusion of the experiment, it is not caused by the independent variable, but the presence of the researcher. So it might be the group who are given the candies, they have higher test score because they see me as a researcher, because the presence of myself, the presence of myself as a researcher, and that it would affect their performance in the tests. So and when they know that they are in the treatment groups and they know the whole idea of the experiment, it could be also the reason why they perform better than the students who are not given the candy. So in this case, to avoid this fallacy, to avoid this error, we need to do an additional procedure that we call blinding or masking. So in the idea of doing blinding or masking is that I'm as a researcher, I should not know which students are assigned to which groups. So I don't know which students are assigned to which groups, and it would reduce the effect of experimental effect. And other than that, it is called the single blind procedure. But when the students also are not aware in which group they are assigned to, and we call it the double-blind procedure. So both the researcher and also the respondents or the participants of the experiments, they are not aware which participants are assigned to which groups. And in that case, we could increase our control in our experiment in experiment research. Yeah, so it's something that this is something that social psychologists normally do in an experiment. And other than experimental methods, even though it is very influential, we have, I would say, undeveloped tradition of doing more experimental research. But what you might find more often in our campus is that most students and also most researchers in our campus, they do non-experimental methods more often than experimental methods. Yeah, even though there are lots of methodological flaws in this option. Yeah, when you are doing experimental methods, for example, you would be very confident to conclude a causal relationship between those variables. So if you find if you find that back in the candy example, if you find that those two groups, there's a differences between the students who are given the candy and the rest who are not given the candy, and you see that the pattern see a conclusive findings that students in the treatment groups they have higher test score. We could confidently say that giving the candy would cause students to perform better in the tests. But in non-experimental methods, those kind of conclusion is hardly drawn, because we only observe the relationship between variables, and correlation again does not imply causation. So if you find that two things are correlated to one another, it doesn't mean that there is a causal relationship between those two variables. For example, if you're doing a survey research, for example, and you try to find correlation between motivation and test score, and you find a positive correlation between motivation and test score, it is very tempting to conclude that higher motivation would cause higher test score. But in this case, if you're doing an observational or cross-sectional research or correlational research, again, correlation does not imply causation. Motivation might partly explain why a test score would be varied, but you cannot say that it caused a higher test score, because in this case, you don't know which one comes first. You don't know whether motivation would imply or would comes first, then it would affect to the test score. But you can only say that it has some correlation, but you don't know which variable that comes first as an cause and which variable that comes last as an effect. Yeah, because that doesn't make sense, because we're not doing experimental research. We don't know whether a higher test score would cause higher motivation or higher motivation would cause a higher test score. Yep. And other options that you might want to consider is that doing archival research, especially when you are interested in finding out or investigating the historical aspects of social psychology. And even though it's not very popular, but some people would use that according to, of course, adhering to their interests. And some people would use case studies, so they try to deeply understand an individual. And this case study method is very popular in some subdisciplines in psychology, for example, in psychoanalysis. But again, the problem of doing case studies, you cannot be sure that if you repeat the study in other people, you would find a consistent result. So it's very limited so doing case studies means the findings would be very limited to one person. You cannot replicate it to another person. And qualitative research, it shares lots of similarities with case studies. And in fact, case studies is a part of qualitative research. So when you questions about the consistency of the result, I would be quite confident to say that should not be your goal, yeah? When you're doing qualitative research, you should expect that if you repeat the research, if you repeat the process to another context, you would find a completely different result, completely different findings. And another thing that you might want to consider is that field studies are not equal to field experiments, because when you're doing field studies, it means that you're just doing observation in a naturalistic setting. So you won't give any manipulation or treatment to your participants. You just sit down and observe. Yeah. So for example, if you want to investigate how people conserve a plastic bag, for example, then you're going to a mini market and then sitting down there and observe how many people are asking for plastic bag and how many people are bringing their own bags, for example. So you don't give any manipulation, you don't give any treatment, you just sit down and watch and also record everything that you see, yeah, and something like that. And there is a very good video, a very good material that I'd like you to watch, and it is available in the slides. I'm not sure whether it is necessary to play it in this video. I think you can do it on your own. And this is very nice video to sum up the whole idea of doing research, not only in social psychology but also in psychology in general. And doing research means, being a scientist means that you need to be ethical in conducting the research. So the thing that I always say to my students when teaching the research method course is that a scientist has to have logic in their mind but ethics in their hearts. Yeah. So you need to be very ethical, and there is no meaningful harm. So if you give harm to your participants for the sake of scientific progress, that would be a complete and total bullshit. So that's it. So there is no harm or there's no harm that is justified in research. So basically you need to be very careful and ethical in treating your participants. So the first thing that you need to make sure is that respecting your participants' privacy. It means that you are not allowed to collect any personal information, yeah, except you really need it. Yeah, you really need it, and it has to be consented by your participants. So the first thing is that you need to make sure that your participant is anonymized, and you need to guarantee the anonymity of your participants, and all the data that has personal information, you need to make sure that those data are confidential. Yeah. But when the data is anonymized, I think it's okay, and it's permissible to share it with other people because it is anonymized data. But if you really need to collect personal data, please don't even think to make it public or maybe pass it to other parties that are not involved in your research. Yeah. So the first thing that you need to make sure is that the anonymity of your participants, and if you cannot guarantee anonymity, you need to make sure that their personal data is confidential. Yeah. And the second the second thing that you need to remember as a scientist, as an aspiring scientist, is that you need to make sure that no harm should be made. Yeah. And I think this is a very general idea of ethical behavior in other disciplines as well. So no harm should not be intended. Yeah, there's no harm should be made. And even though for a very good reason, like this is for the sake of scientific progress, that is not a justifiable argument. And you might question, is there any psychological research that has any psychological research made some degree of harm. And you might be surprised that some social psychological research were extremely extreme, yeah, were extremely extreme and controversial when it comes to doing harm to the people. Because, we're doing research to people, so of course, lots of harms could be made, yeah. But of course, that is not ethical, and you are not allowed to do that. And the next questions that concerns on research ethics is that are we allowed to do deception, to give manipulation to our participants? Because if we completely disclose all the experimental procedure to the participants, they would behave unnaturally, and this is something that we don't want. So back in the candy case, if I explain to students that I'm going to do an experimental research, and then students who are given the candy I expect that the students who are given the candy would perform better. They might be perform better not because of the candies, but because of my expectation, yeah. And of course, in that case, we cannot disclose all the experimental procedure to our participants. And in that case, we need to do deception. And is that allowed or not? And some psychologists would give you an answer. It is possible to do that. It is okay to do that, but you need to do the briefing at the end of the procedure. So you need to explain to participants. You need to explain and completely disclose the whole procedure of the experiments at the end of the experiment. And before the experiment is conducted, you need to also give a clue to participants that you would use deception in your research. Even though you would not give them, you would not go into detail what kind of deception that you use, but you need to make sure that that your participants are aware that deception, some degree of deception would be used in the procedure that they are going to take part. And other thing that is also equally important is that obtaining informed consent. Yeah. So before participants deciding to participate, they need to give you their consent. So they are fully aware. They are not forced. Yeah. You cannot force them to participate. It should be voluntary participation, and they give their consent to participate in your research prior to data collection. Yeah, so this is a very strict procedure that you need to make sure you should obtain it first before letting your participants taking part in your research. Yeah, so these are famous classical experiments in social psychology. And I'm going to go into a short detail so you would learn something very interesting in social psychology. So the first social psychological experiment that has been conducted was the experiment conducted by Norman Triplett. Yeah, so he compared the performance of a cyclist when the cyclist was competing with other cyclists, and when they are cycling alone, yeah. And surprisingly, well, not surprisingly, I think, the cyclists who compete with other cyclists, they perform better when compared to when they are cycling alone, yeah. So Norman Triplett then came into conclusion that the presence of others would increase our performance, yeah. This is something that we call social facilitation. And also, the second experiment is also quite interesting. The Solomon Asch experiments in social conformity or group conformity. So the procedure was like this. Yeah. So Solomon Asch recruited participants to participate in his research, and he prepared a stimulus that consists of 3 lines. Yeah, three similar lines. So when you take a look at those lines, you would see that these 3 lines are actually in this completely similar length, yeah. But what Solomon Asch did was he recruited a number of people that played themselves as actors, yeah, as paid actors, And Solomon gave them an instruction to deliberately give a false answer. Yes, Solomon asked those groups to give deliberately false answer. So Solomon expect the group or these paid actors to give answers as if those 3 lines are not in the similar length. And when the participants came in, and at first Solomon asked them about the length of those 3 lines, the participant was firstly very confident in answering that those 3 lines are in the same length. There's no differences between those 3 lines because, in fact, it's the same length. It's the same lines with the same length. But then, after hearing the allegedly false answer from the rest of the groups, then the participants started to change their answers according to adhering to the group's questions. So Solomon then came into conclusion that the pressure of a group, would enough to force or to unconsciously force individual to adjust themselves or to adjust their behavior so that it would be similar to the group. That is very interesting experiment. And the third experiment is that was conducted by Muzaffar and Caroline Sharif. I have the video, and we would see the procedure of this experiment. This is also a very interesting experiment on realistic conflict theory. And the next experiment was from Milgram. This is quite interesting as well. I'll give you the video because the procedure are quite long. And if you are interested in watching the video, I think if you type any keywords in YouTube about Milgram's experiment, even if you are looking for the documentary, the realistic documentary of that experiment, it would give you a lot of findings, and you can watch it yourself. And also the next experiment would be Latane and Darley's experiment, on bystander effect. So this is a phenomenon where bystander they ignore the cry for help from other people who are really need help, but some people would choose to be a bystander. They just act like nothing happens. And this experiment was inspired by a real case of the murder of Kitty Genovese. So Kitty Genovese in the 1964 or 1965. So the case was extremely infuriating. So Kitty Genovese was walking at the middle of the night, I suppose, and she was attacked and raped and murdered by a criminal. And she was asking for help. She was crying and asking and screaming for help, and no one actually giving her help. And that was what was surprising was that when the police came down and asked some people who lived around the area, lots of people actually heard Kitty screaming, but not until 20 minutes after the attack, someone finally decided to call the police. So that is very interesting experiment as well. So Latane and Darley tried to formulate an experiment to answer why people are simply choosing not to help when they actually when they are actually realize that someone needs their help. And the last experiment, I think this is most notorious and most careless experiment, conducted by a social psychologist. I think you may have heard it before because this is quite popular, even in popular culture, because I'm aware that there is a movie on Netflix that you could watch inspired by this experiment. So Philip Zimbardo from Stanford, he recruited a group of students, male students, and he divided those groups into 2 different groups. So one group would act as a guard in a jail, and the rest would act as the criminal. And what happens is that after a number of days playing their role as a guard and also the criminals, the guard acted harshly and quite aggressive, quite aggressive towards the criminals, the suspected criminals, and they internalize this role, and this is something that Zimbardo used as an evidence as a confirming evidence of his concept of Lucifer effect. But the problem is that after many years after this experiment was conducted, someone finally decided to replicate the experiment, and it was quite famous as well because a prominent TV station aired the whole experiment, so BBC Prison experiment, and those researchers did not find the same effect, and it happens after a few years back, only like 2 or 3 years before, 2 years ago, a document revealed, and it captured a very disturbing phenomenon. And it says that Zimbardo actually instructed the guard to act harshly. So it was not because the nature of the experiment, as Zimbardo claimed, but the guards acted harshly as instructed by the experimenter. So of course this is completely different. It would change the whole idea or the conclusion of this experiment. Now, so after this, you're going to watch a very interesting short clip describing the procedure of a field experiment conducted by Muzaffar Sharif and Caroline Sharif as well.
Between 1949 and 1954, social psychologist Muzaffar Sharif and Carolyn Wood Sharif collaborated with graduate students to hold a series of experiments to test one of Dr. Sharif's ideas, known as realistic conflict theory. This having to do with intergroup conflict, stereotypes, and prejudices. The most famous and significant of his experiments took place in 1954 at Robbers Cave State Park in Oklahoma. Sharif's main idea was that conflict arises between groups when they're competing for limited resources. This hypothesis had important implications as the Second World War had recently ended. The experiments involved 22 children between the ages of 11 and 12. None of them knew each other previously, and all came from similar backgrounds: middle class, white, and Protestant. The experiment had 3 stages, the first being a bonding stage. Before the two groups were made aware of each other, they were encouraged to bond and create social norms by engaging in activities such as swimming and hiking. Here the groups took names, the Eagles and the Rattlers, and developed their own cultures and cultural norms. The next stage was the competition stage, lasting 4 to 6 days. In this stage, there was to be friction between the groups, and as such, a series of competitions were arranged. These competitions included baseball, tug-of-war, and touch football, among others. The winners would receive a trophy, medals, and pocket knives. There was no alternative prize for the losers. The Rattlers, who had developed a norm of toughness and aggression, became emphatically confident in their success. They put Rattlers' flags on the baseball field and made threats about bothering them. The researchers then manipulated situations where one group would gain at the cost of the other. What started as verbal aggression between the groups soon escalated further. After one of the baseball games, the Eagles burned the Rattlers' flag. The next day, the Rattlers raided the Eagles' cabin, flipping beds and stealing personal items. Soon, fistfights would break out, and the researchers had to physically separate the children. After the end of the conflict period, where it was announced that the Eagles were the winners, there was a reducing friction period. The groups were asked to characterize the other group, and it was found that there were profoundly negative characterizations, while holding their own group in high esteem. During this time, the two groups were brought together to engage in non-competitive activities. Sheriff believed that simple contact between the groups would not reduce friction. Instead, there would need to be common, superordinate goals to accomplish. In one event, the boys were to watch a movie together, but had to chip in money of their own. They worked together to decide the splitting of the money. They also had to work to fix an issue with a water tank and the water supply at camp, which the researchers had arranged. Likewise, one of the trucks delivering food became stuck and had to be pulled out by the children working together. At this point, the kids had come together, no longer as enemies, but as allies with a common goal. Musafar and Carolyn Sheriff had successfully demonstrated realistic conflict theory. Normal boys became their own cultures and showed that conflict for limited resources can lead to prejudiced attitudes and discriminatory behaviors. While simple coexistence did not eliminate these prejudices, working together towards something better for both groups did.
Yeah, that is one example of one of the earliest social psychological experiments, and the theory that comes out as a conclusion of that experiment is extremely prominent in explaining how people cooperate with each other and how they resolve conflicts. And you would see that those explanations are the theory itself, how people divide themselves into groups, categorize themselves into groups, and how actually conflict arises. And it is more caused by the competition in having the limited resources, and also to reduce the discrimination, to reduce the conflict between those two groups. Only simple contact would not work, but rather than that, we could use we could increase cooperation between those conflicting groups by pushing them to work or to achieve one similar goal altogether. And I think the conclusion of this experiment could go beyond other social contexts, and it's very close to our reality as well. Yeah, because we know that there are lots of social conflicts around us, and this theory would be discussed later in other course that you are taking as well. I think it's in social interaction, if I'm not mistaken. So you're going to learn more about the theory later in other courses. So this would be the end of the second part of today's material, of today's lecture, and I'm going to proceed to the last part of the lecture, that is discussing about the problems and the crisis that plaguing social psychology as a science.